this is Jen from Windrose Fiber Studio. Today we'll be crocheting the Teddy Bear Crossbody. For this project, you will need 5 skeins of Teddy by Go Handmade. You will also need a pair of scissors, a 6mm crochet hook, a yarn needle for weaving in your loose ends, and a set of 12 stitch markers. I will leave links for the yarn and the stitch markers below. Now before we start crocheting, let's just take a quick look at the sample that I've made. I want you to have a sense of what we'll be working on first, second, third, and so on. We're going to be beginning at the middle of the bottom of the bag, and then we're going to crochet our way up the side, all the way across the handle. Then we're going to go back down the other side and meet at the bottom middle. That's going to be our first big main piece. After that, we'll be crocheting the front panel and then also the back panel, and then all of it will be sewn together. In writing this pattern, I had to give it a difficulty rating of intermediate, and that is largely because we're working with a fur yarn. If you're not used to working with novelty yarns, in particular fur, it can be very challenging to see where your stitches are. Because of that, I'm using a little hack to help us get started. You can see I'm threading 10 stitch markers onto the working yarn. This will seem a little fiddly at first, and this is just for the very first row. And it's to help avoid any frustration as you're getting started. This is actually a nice little trick you can use anytime you're working with a novelty yarn. So hopefully you'll find it a handy hack. So now that I have 10 stitch markers on my working yarn, I'm going to go ahead and join my yarn to my hook with a slip knot. And now we're going to work 10 single crochets. Before each stitch, we're actually going to be drawing up one of those stitch markers. So you can see I'm drawing up a stitch marker and then yarn over, pull through a loop. That's chain 1. I draw up the next stitch marker, yarn over and pull through a loop, and that's chain 2. I'm just going to keep doing this 10 times until we have 10 chains on our hook. Okay, here we are. You can see we have our 10 chains and our 10 stitch markers. And now we're going to start row 1. I'm going to begin by chaining 1, turning the work. That chain 1 gives us the height of a single crochet, and we are going to be working single crochets across our beginning chain. Because we have these stitch markers in place, it's much easier to find where you're going to be placing your hook. You can see I'm pulling on that stitch marker just a little bit to open up that space, and then I can insert my hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. That's a single crochet. Once you make your stitch, you can remove that stitch marker and move on to the next. Let's watch again. I just use that stitch marker to help me find where to place my hook and finish my single crochet. We are going to keep working our way across until we have 10 single crochets, and that will complete row 1. If you happen to be very comfortable working with novelty yarn and you'd rather not use the stitch markers, you're going to chain 11, turn, and beginning with the second chain on your hook, single crochet across. So row 1 is a row of 10 single crochets. Okay, so we've just completed row 1 and we're ready to move on. At the end of each row, you're going to chain 1 and turn. And now for rows 2 through 18, we are simply going to be working single crochets across. Each row will have 10 single crochets. And this is where you're starting to work into the fur yarn. You can see how I'm using my thumb and my middle finger, and I'm kind of wiggling them back and forth a little bit, and it just sort of opens up the stitch and makes it easy for me to find where I'm going to place my hook. This might feel very challenging at first, but as you continue on, it will become more comfortable. Sometimes the very last stitch can be a little harder to find. Just take your time. Okay, so now I'm going to chain 1 and turn and begin row 3. Because we're working by our sense of feel, I do like to count my rows in my head and make sure that I have 10 single crochets at the end of each row. It would be so easy to accidentally skip a stitch or work 2 single crochets in one. So just take your time and find your stitches and maybe keep a nice little count going as you work your way back and forth across. And I think you'll find yourself able to work faster and faster. Okay, so we're not at row 18 yet, but I want to take a moment and stop and look at our work. I'm placing a stitch marker in my loop, just so if my yarn is pulled, it doesn't pull out my work. That's a nice little trick you can use. And now if we turn our fabric over so that the beginning tail end is actually on the left, and lay it flat. Row 1 is right here, and you can see the work looks like a series of valleys and hills. Row 1 being a valley, and then row 2 is a hill, valley, hill, valley, hill. And that makes it much easier to count our work. So row 1, 2 is a hill, so we can say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. We have 12 rows. So now I'm just going to carry on, and I will meet you at row 18. Okay, so here we are at row 18. If we count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, hopefully you're getting much more comfortable working with the fur, and you've accomplished your first section. Okay, we're going to place a stitch marker at either end of row 18. Now moving on to row 19, we're going to go ahead and do the chain 1 turn at the end of row 18, and 19 is going to be an increase row. So to work row 19, we're going to do 2 single crochets in the first stitch. Now if your stitch marker is in your way, you can take that out and put it back in at the end of the row. So in that first stitch, we're going to do 2 single crochets. And then we're going to be working 8 single crochets across. And then we'll be working 2 single crochets in that last stitch. So we're increasing to 12 single crochets. Okay, so now we're at the end of row 19. And I'm going to do the increase, which means 2 single crochets in that last stitch. Because we took those stitch markers out, we need to put those back in at row 18. Okay, moving on, we're going to chain 1 turn, and for row 20 we will just be single crocheting across for a total of 12 single crochets. Chain 1 turn, and now for row 21 we'll be working another increase row. In your first stitch, work 2 single crochets. That's your single crochet increase. Then you'll be working 10 single crochets across. Okay, so we're going to single crochet increase in the last stitch. That gives us a row with 14 single crochets. So if we take just a moment to look at our piece, we've got our stitch markers in row 18, 19 is the valley and an increase row. And then we have row 20, which is single crochet across, and then row 21, another increase row. So we've gone from 10 stitches across to 14 stitches across. Okay, you can see that we're diving right back in. For rows 22 through 40, we will be working single crochet across, chain 1 turn at the end of each row. Each row will have 14 stitches or 14 single crochet. Okay, so here I am at row 40. Going to put a stitch marker just to hold my work. And I want to just take another moment to look at our work. I find that now that it's getting longer, those rows are more defined. So I wanted to take a moment so we can really count them together. Remember that beginning tail end is on the left. The even rows 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 are the hills, row 18. 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, 38, 40. Okay, so here we are at row 40. Okay, so now we're on row 41, which is another increase row. So we'll be working a single crochet increase in the first stitch, 12 single crochets across, and then an increase in the last. So here we go. Single crochet increase, single crochet across, 12 stitches, then we jump to the end where we'll be working an increase in the last stitch for a total of 16 stitches. There's that increase. Then we want to chain 1 and turn. For row 42, we'll just be doing single crochet across, 16 stitches, and now at row 43 we're going to increase again. We'll work an increase, 14 single crochets across, and an increase for a total of 18 stitches. Okay, so now we are going to work on rows 44 through 52. Each of these rows is just a single crochet across, chain 1, turn. Each of these rows will have 18 stitches. The important thing in this section is that we will be placing stitch markers on either end of both rows 44 and 52. Because it is easier to put those stitch markers in place after you've finished the row beyond it, I'm crocheting to row 45 and then I'm placing the stitch markers in row 44. Row 44 is the hill. And now we're jumping ahead. I've crocheted a few more rows. We're up to row 52. Actually, I just finished row 53, and we're going to place our stitch markers in row 52. So counting up, we have 44, 46, 48, 50, 52. We'll place our stitch markers on either end of row 52. Okay, let's just take a moment to look at our piece so far. Remember, we started at the center of the bottom of the bag, so rows 1 through 18 are half of the width of the bottom of the bag, about 7 inches. The bag overall will be 14 inches wide. And then from the first set of stitch markers to the second, we have 10 inches. 10 inches will be the height of the body of the bag. So you have a bag that's 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall. Between the last 2 sets of stitch markers is 3 inches. This is a space between the top of your bag and where we will begin to sew together our shoulder strap. Okay, let's continue on. So for rows 53 through 112, we are going to continue as we have been doing, working single crochets across, chaining 1 and then turning. Each row will have 18 stitches. This will be creating the length of our shoulder strap. Remember that I had already crocheted row 53, so I'm beginning with row 54. I have not made it to row 112 yet, but I'm about to run out of yarn, so I thought I would show you how to join a new skein. I like to do this at the edge of the piece. I've pulled out my last stitch and I'm going to insert my hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then I'm going to use the new yarn to pull through the last 2 loops on my hook. And then with the new skein, I'll chain 1 and turn. I'm going to go ahead and crochet the next row. And then when I get to the end of the next row, I'm going to go back and trim any excess yarn. I like to have those loose ends on the end because they will be nicely hidden when I'm finishing off my shoulder strap. Okay, I just finished row 112. I want to take another quick look. Now is the time to really think about your desired strap length. Ours will be 30 inches long when we're done, but there is so much stretch in this fabric, it can stretch up to as much as another 15 inches. So it could go from about 30 inches to 45. So you can use the length of your favorite crossbody as a reference. But remember, when you're deciding on the length of your strap, to account for how much this fabric will stretch, particularly once you have your phone, your wallet, any kind of weight in your shoulder bag. When we make the shoulder strap, we'll be folding either end towards the center and sewing it together, which will give it a little bit more structure, but still this is a strap that has a lot of stretch to it. Okay, now we're moving on to rows 113 through 121. These rows are also single crochet across, chain 1 turn, 18 stitches in each row. We are now starting to work our way back down the other side of the bag. It's important to note that these rows generate another 3 inches of length that you will need to account for when deciding on the length of your shoulder strap. I just finished row 114 and you can see the valley, row 113 right here, where I will place my stitch markers. Okay, I'm going to continue crocheting until I reach row 121 and I will meet you at row 122 where we will start with our first decrease. Okay, now we're on to row 122. We'll start with a decrease over the first 2 stitches, and then we'll work 14 single crochets across and a decrease over the last 2 stitches. To work a decrease, you're going to insert your hook into the first stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop, and then insert your hook into the second stitch, yarn over and pull up another loop, then yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on your hook. You've just worked your first single crochet decrease, and now we're going to do 14 single crochets across. When you reach your last 2 stitches, you'll work another decrease just as you did before. Okay, so remember, you insert your hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, then you insert your hook in the next stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, then yarn over and pull through all three. Now that is row 122 complete. And so I'm going to go ahead and take a second and put my stitch markers in row 121. It's just so much easier to place your stitch markers after you've done the next row. So remember, we have stitch markers in row 113, and now we're placing our next set on either end of row 121. For row 123, we will be working single crochets across. Remember, at this point we have 16 stitches in our row. Okay, chain 1, turn. And now for row 124, this is another decrease row. We're going to work a single crochet decrease over the first 2 stitches. And then we'll be working 12 single crochets across. And then single crochet decrease over the last 2 stitches. Now we have 14 stitches in our row. And for rows 125 through 143, we'll be working single crochets across. Row 144 is another decrease row. We'll be working a single crochet decrease over the first 2 stitches. Okay, so here we go, decrease. And then we'll work 10 single crochets across, and then another single crochet decrease over the last 2 stitches. So now we've reduced to 12 stitches. Going to chain 1, turn. Row 145, you just simply single crochet across. Remember, it's 12 stitches, and then you'll chain 1, turn. That puts us at row 146, which is a decrease row. So we'll work a single crochet decrease over the first 2 stitches, then 8 single crochets across, and then we'll decrease again over the last 2 stitches. For rows 147 through 164, we will be working single crochets across. Row 147 will have stitch markers on either end. When you reach the end of row 164, do not chain 1 and turn, but finish off your work leaving at least 8 inches for sewing. And just like that, we've made it to the end of row 164. I have my entire piece laid out in front of me. At this point, there isn't a right side or a wrong side, so you can determine which side you like the best and make that the right side. We'll have the wrong side facing whenever we're sewing our seams. So making sure you don't have a twist in your work, go ahead and thread your tail in onto a yarn needle, and then holding those two sides together, we're just going to whip stitch row 1 to row 164. With our seam complete, our work forms a large ring, and now it's time to take a couple of minutes to sew in our loose ends. When I sew in my loose ends, I like to pass the needle through my work. I go in one direction, making sure not to cinch it too tight. Then I come back again. And then I do a third pass. I find that if you go back, forth, and back again, it makes the connection very secure. Before moving on, place a stitch marker at the seam you sewed, joining row 1 and row 164. The top of your stitch marker will mark the wrong side of your work. The space between the first and last stitch markers will be the base of your bag. The next set of stitch markers is the top of the body of the bag, but if we slide the work down and scrunch it up a little so that we can fit the whole thing in the frame, the space between the third set of stitch markers and the next set is our shoulder strap. This is the part we'll be sewing together next. So measure out a length of yarn that's at least twice the length of your shoulder strap. I like to give myself a little extra length just to be on the safe side. Okay, I've turned my work. You can see row 1 is where our stitch marker is placed. We'll pass row 18, the first set of stitch markers, and the next set of stitch markers. And then we're going to move on to the third set. This is where we are going to begin to sew. You can see that we have the wrong side facing. There's my stitch marker right here. And now going back up to the shoulder strap, we're going to take the outsides and fold them each toward the middle. And this is the seam we're going to be sewing. I've already threaded my needle, and I'm going to begin by joining these two stitch markers. So you can see I'm just passing the needle through one stitch marker and then across to the other. I want to make sure I get under at least a couple strands of yarn so I have a nice secure hold here, I'm going to go right back through and do it again. And then I'm going to pull this loop until it's closed, and I'm just going to leave that tail in to weave in later. Now we're going to weave our strap a little differently from before. Instead of doing a whip stitch, go under the left side, work the needle from the underneath to the top, and then do the same for the opposite side. So notice my yarn is going from the wrong side to the right side, from the bottom to the top. You want to pull your work but not too tight. Let's do it again. So from the bottom to the top. What's nice about sewing a seam like this is it does not create a ridge, because otherwise you would feel that ridge on your shoulder. This will create a nice flat seam. Now before I get too far, I'm going to take just a moment and I'm going to attach the sides together. I'm using these little sewing clips. You could use some extra stitch markers. You could pin them together. Anything you have handy. So these are the stitch markers where we'll be finishing our seam. And then I can just take a minute and line up either side. I can make sure the hill rows are lined up with the hill rows and the valleys with the valleys. And then when you're done, you can be confident that your sides are even. Now I'm just going to carry on sewing my shoulder strap. As I get to each clip, I'll remove it and keep going. Okay, and now I've made it all the way to the end. I'm going to do the same thing with the last two clips that I did with the first two, or stitch markers rather. I'm going to loop the yarn through and then do a second pass. And now I can actually take out 4 stitch markers, the 2 at the beginning of the shoulder strap and the 2 at the end. That is very satisfying. I hope you feel the same way. Go ahead and weave in these loose ends. Just thread your yarn back on the needle and weave them in just as before. And you're done. So go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back. Congratulations! You just finished the first big part of this project. Well done! As we bask in the glory of this accomplishment, let's take a closer look. You can see our shoulder strap is a hollow tube. And honestly, that's part of what makes it so comfortable. You have 2 squishy sides supporting your purse over your shoulder, and it's just so cozy. It might seem a little short right now, but remember, the strap is going to stretch a bit, so fear not. Look at all that stretch. And now we're going to move on. Are you ready to jump back in? So let's begin working on the first side of the body of the bag. You can see I have the bottom facing up. Right here is the top of that stitch marker. And then we're going to be working from one set of stitch markers across to the other. Remember, they're each 18 stitches away from the center. So by working from one to the other, we'll have rows of 36 stitches going up. And actually, before we get started, I just wanted to point out that I'm going to begin using a new skein. It takes about one skein of Teddy to do each side, and this means we will have fewer loose ends to weave in, which is always nice. And keeping that in mind, I'm going to measure out about 2 feet of yarn, or 2.5. That should be more than enough. And that's going to be our beginning tail end. We'll be using this length of yarn later on to sew our seams. So now I begin with a slip knot on my hook, and I'm going to work from this stitch marker, and I'm going to join with a single crochet. Just insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through both loops on your hook. That's how you join with a single crochet. And now I'm going to work one single crochet in the end of each row evenly across. The center stitch marker is where you should be at 18 stitches, so that can be a guide point for you. And here we go. I'm reaching the opposite stitch marker at exactly stitch 36, and this is the end of row 1. You can see how nice that blends in together. So we're going to just keep going back and forth doing rows of single crochet, 36 stitches across. We'll do a chain 1 turn at the end of each row. Chain 1, turn your work, for rows 2 through 27, single crochet across, chain 1 turn. Each row will have 36 stitches. At the end of row 27, finish off leaving at least 24 inches of yarn for sewing the side seam. Okay, so we've just completed the first side of the body of the bag. Before we move on to the second side, I want to show you a little trick to help with yarn management. We have these long beginning and ending tails, and a nice way to keep them out of your way as you crochet the next side of your bag is to turn them into little butterflies. So I just pulled the working yarn through the last loop on my hook, and now I'm going to make a butterfly with my beginning tail. So I just wrap the yarn around 4 fingers and then wrap the yarn around the middle, and when I get close to the end, I make a little loop and pull the end through that loop. And I don't pull it very tight. It doesn't take much to secure it. And then I do the same thing for the other end of yarn. And that just keeps these long pieces of yarn out of my way until I'm ready to use them. Okay, so if we start with our beginning stitch marker and count up, we've got 27 rows. And we're all good to move on to the second side. So let's flip our piece over, and now you can see the other set of stitch markers on the opposite side, and we're going to work this panel just as we did the last one. 27 rows, 36 stitches across, until we have both sides of the body of the bag. Here we are, all done with our crocheting. Nothing left to do but sew our seams. You can see how I'm lining up the side of this panel with the side of the shoulder strap, the side of the very first piece we made. We'll work our seam from one stitch marker to the other stitch marker. I've pulled out my sewing clips again, just so I can line up both sides and have them be even. We're going to sew these seams in the exact same manner that we sewed the shoulder strap. I'm going to go ahead and speed my way through this, and I'll see you in just a moment. Look at how nice the finish is. Okay, we're going to do the exact same thing for our last 3 seams. I'll speed us up once again, and I'll see you at the finish line. Cheers to you, you're all done. I hope you love it. I hope you can see why I called it the teddy bear, because it's so soft and plushy. I think the nicest way to finish off any crochet bag is with a zipper lining. I'm going to leave a link in the description below for my favorite tutorial so that you can do just that. I hope you enjoyed making the Teddy Bear Crossbody. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to purchase a written copy of this pattern, which also includes instructions for how to sew a zipper lining, I'll leave a link for you in the description. If you enjoyed this project, please click the like button and subscribe. I'll be sharing videos on Tuesdays, and I can't wait to share more patterns with you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.